While the alphas were burning the world down, she was the one keeping it alive. Every army marching across those territories needed to eat. Every wounded soldier needed medicine. Every mercenary sharpening his blade in the dark needed to know who was paying and where to go. And every single one of those needs, without exception, without alternative, passed through her hands first. No one knew her name in the councils of war. No one spoke it at the political tables where lords divided territories, like cuts of meat. She was invisible in the way that only the most dangerous people ever managed to be, not because she lacked power, but because she had spent years making sure the world looked everywhere else, while she built something the world could not function without. Caravans moved through routes that didn't exist on any official map. Medicines arrived in besieged territories that should have had no access to supply lines. Mercenaries switched allegiances at moments so precise they felt like accidents, except accidents don't happen that consistently, and they don't always benefit the same quiet hand. The alphas thought they were fighting over land, over bloodlines, over the ancient, bruising question of who had the right to rule. They screamed it at each other across burning fields and inside the ruins of alliances that collapsed faster than they could be rebuilt. They measured power in armies and territory, and the fear in other men's eyes. Not one of them stopped to ask who was feeding those armies. Not one of them thought to trace the medicine back to its source, or follow the mercenary contracts to the name at the very beginning of the chain. Not one of them understood, until it was far too late, that the war they believed they were controlling had a puppeteer they had never once looked at, because she was an Omega, and in that world, Omegas don't control things. Except she did. All of it. And the moment the alphas finally realized it, everything they thought they knew about power collapsed in a single breath. Think about what that actually means for a moment. Every alpha who ever looked through her, every council that never invited her to the table, every lord who used the word Omega like it was a synonym for irrelevant, they were all, without knowing it, being kept alive by her decisions. The food that reached their soldiers at the front line, the medicine that saved their heirs when fever swept through the strongholds in winter, the mercenary, blades that turned the tide of battles they still tell stories about with pride. All of it moved because she allowed it to move. All of it stopped the moment she decided it should stop. She never asked for recognition. That is perhaps the most extraordinary part of everything that follows. She did not build what she built out of ambition, in the way the alphas understood ambition, loud and territorial and desperate for witness. She built it out of something colder and more patient and ultimately far more powerful than any of them possessed. She built it because she understood from a very young age that the world had decided what she was allowed to be, and she had simply decided not to agree. There is a specific kind of intelligence that only develops in people who have been underestimated long enough. It stops caring about being seen. It stops performing for rooms that were never going to applaud it. It goes quiet and deep and focused, and it builds in the dark. And by the time anyone thinks to look, it has already become load-bearing. She was load-bearing for the entire Northern War economy before the first major battle was even fought. If you have ever felt like the room was looking past you, while you were already 10 steps ahead of everyone in it, you already understand something about who she is. Drop that feeling in the comments, because this story was written for exactly those people, and what she does with that invisibility is something that is going to be very difficult to watch without feeling it somewhere personal. Stay close. What she built in the shadows is only the beginning of what this story reveals, and the moment her name finally enters that council chamber, nothing in that world will ever be the same again. Her name was Sable, not a title, not a family name worth carving into stone or stitching into banners. Just Sable, which was what her mother had called her in the small hours of a difficult birth in a village that appeared on no strategic map and generated no taxes worth collecting, and produced nothing the great packs of the Northern Reach had ever considered worth wanting. She was the third child of a woman who traded dried herbs and minor remedies from a cart that moved between settlements too small to have permanent markets. She grew up understanding scarcity, the way children who grow up around it always do, completely, practically, without the sentimentality that people who have never been hungry bring to the concept of need She was an Omega. In the world of the packs, this was not a neutral descriptor. It was a position in a structure that had been calcifying for generations, a structure that assigned value according to categories so old and so repeatedly reinforced that most people inside it had stopped being able to see them as categories at all and experienced them simply as reality. Alphas led, betas maintained. Omegas existed in the spaces that the other two didn't bother to occupy, filling functions that were necessary but invisible, doing work that kept systems running but generated none of the recognition that the structure reserved for dominance and strength. Sable had understood the structure by the time she was 9 years old, not resentfully, not yet. With the specific clarity of a child who has a particular kind of mind and has been placed in circumstances that develop it early. She understood that the structure was real, that fighting it directly was not a viable strategy, and that the people who benefited most from it were also the least likely to notice the spaces it left open. Not out of malice, out of attention directed elsewhere. The alphas were always looking at each other. They were measuring each other, testing each other, positioning themselves relative to each other in the endless territorial mathematics of dominance and submission that consumed most of their energy and almost all of their focus. Nobody was looking down, which meant nobody was watching what was building in, the spaces they weren't looking at. She made her first trade at 11 years old. Nothing dramatic. A piece of information she had overheard, the route a particular merchant would be taking through the lowland pass, sold to a competing trader for a quantity of dried meat that her family needed and could not afford. The transaction took 4 minutes and left no trace. The man who bought the information used it, made a profit, and forgot entirely that the source had been a small Omega girl with quiet eyes who had been sitting in the corner of the market square, doing what quiet girls with quiet eyes are assumed to do in corners. Nothing. She had been doing many things. She had been listening to every conversation within range. She had been mapping the movement of goods through that market with the automatic precision of a mind that catalogues patterns without being asked to. She had been watching which merchants spoke to, which others, which transactions happened in the open and which happened after the crowd thinned, which goods changed hands officially and which ones moved through routes that left nothing written down. She understood at 11 that the official economy and the real economy were two different things, running parallel, intersecting constantly, and that the real economy had no gatekeepers because the people who built the official one had never bothered to police the spaces between it. Those spaces were her territory before she had a name for territory. By 14, she had 17 regular contacts across 4 settlements, merchants primarily, and the people who worked for merchants, the drivers and loaders and record keepers who knew exactly what was moving and where it was going, and which portions of it were not appearing in any official accounting. She paid them in information that was worth more than money, the specific kind of information that lets a person make decisions faster and more accurately than their competitors, and they paid her, back in access and in the expansion of her network, each new contact generating the possibility of contacts beyond them. Her mother died when Sable was 15. She did not have time to grieve in the way the word implies, the sustained internal processing of loss that requires a certain amount of security to complete. She had 3 younger siblings and a cart and a series of supplier relationships that would dissolve without active maintenance. She maintained them. She folded grief into the ongoing work of survival, the way people who cannot afford to stop fold everything, as fuel, as weight carried, as understanding that loss is a teacher that doesn't give you the option of not attending its lessons. She learned from it that dependency is the most dangerous condition a person can be in, and that the antidote to dependency is not strength but indispensability. The strong can always be overpowered by someone stronger, but the person that everyone depends on cannot be removed without removing the function they provide, and removing the function is a cost that most people, when they are made to actually calculate it, cannot afford to pay. She spent the next 3 years becoming indispensable, quietly, methodically, with the patient, long-horizon thinking that belongs to people who have never had the luxury of short-term solutions. She was 18 when she made the move that changed everything. Two rival pack territories had been in a state of low-level conflict for 6 years. Not quite war, not quite peace. The kind of grinding territorial tension that damages economies without generating the decisive confrontations that resolve things. Both sides needed goods the other side controlled. Both sides had too much pride and too much political investment in the hostility to approach the other directly. Both sides were therefore paying significantly inflated prices for inferior alternatives obtained through roundabout routes that added weeks and sometimes months to supply chains. Sable approached both sides. Separately, discreetly, through intermediaries she had spent years positioning in exactly these kinds of useful places. She proposed not peace, which would have been rejected immediately on political grounds, but a practical arrangement. The goods would move, the routes would be maintained. No official contact between the territories would be required or recorded. Both sides would receive what they needed at prices significantly below what they were currently paying, and the difference between those prices and the actual cost of the operation would constitute her fee. Both sides agreed. Neither told the other they had agreed. Both believed they were receiving a service unavailable to their enemy, which was technically true in the sense that the specific service each received was calibrated to their specific needs, and both believed they were the cleverer party in the arrangement. Sable was 17 days past her 18th birthday and was operating a covert supply route between two hostile territories, while both believed they had the exclusive loyalty of the person running it. She understood then, with a clarity that settled into her chest like something finally confirmed rather than discovered, that this was what she had been building toward. Not a single trade, not a single route, a position. The position of the person who exists between all sides simultaneously, who belongs to none of them, who is therefore indispensable to all of them, whose removal creates a problem that no one side can solve because the solution requires access to every side at once. She was, in the language the packs used for everything except the things that mattered, nobody. She was an omega with no territory, no bloodline, no pack affiliation, no standing in any council, no name that appeared in any political correspondence. She was invisible in the way that she had always been invisible, which she had long since stopped experiencing as a wound and started experiencing as infrastructure. Invisible things, properly built, are the most durable things in any system. They cannot be attacked because they cannot be found. They cannot be dismantled because no one in power has ever acknowledged their existence. They grow in the dark, and they become load-bearing, and by the time anyone notices them, the cost of removing them has become higher than anyone is willing to pay. She was 22 when the war began. Not a skirmish, not a territorial dispute of the kind that flared and cooled on a seasonal cycle across the northern reach. A war, the kind that starts with a single act of sufficient insult, spreads through the web of alliances and counter-alliances that every pack had been constructing for decades, and becomes self-sustaining within weeks, as each new development creates new grievances that require new responses that generate new developments. The kind that, once started, cannot be stopped simply because the people fighting it have run out of reasons, because by that point the conflict has generated its own reasons. Momentum mistaken for necessity, violence mistaken for purpose. The official supply routes collapsed within 3 months. This was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention to supply routes, which, it turned out, was almost no one in a position to do anything about it. The pack councils had been focused on troop movements, territorial positions, alliance negotiations, the visible machinery of warfare. They had not been focused on the infrastructure that fed that machinery, because infrastructure is boring and warfare is urgent, and in every conflict that has ever been fought, the urgent has a tendency to completely consume the attention that should have been divided with the important. The food shortages arrived first. Not catastrophically, not initially, but persistently, the specific kind of shortage that doesn't generate immediate crisis, but degrades everything over time, that turns a fighting force from an instrument of precision into something more desperate, and therefore more dangerous and ultimately less effective. The medicine shortages arrived next, which in the context of active warfare was a different category of problem entirely. Then the mercenary contracts began to dissolve, as the reliable payment chains that sustained them were disrupted by the same logistical failures that were affecting everything else. The pack leaders began to send messages through official channels first, which was protocol, and through official channels the messages went unanswered or were answered with information that had been accurate 2 weeks ago and was now useless. Then through unofficial channels, which was where the messages began to arrive at the same address that a significant portion of the Northern Reach's shadow economy had been routing through for years. Her address, her network, her decision about whether to respond. She responded to all of them, in her own time, on her own terms, through intermediaries who presented the contact as a fortunate connection rather than a deliberate architecture, maintaining the useful fiction that what was happening was opportunity rather than design. She could have corrected the fiction. She chose not to. The fiction was valuable precisely because it positioned her as a resource being accessed rather than a power being petitioned, and the distinction mattered enormously for what was coming next. Lord Garrett Holt was the first Alpha to meet her in person. He was the commander of the Eastern Reach forces, 44 years old, a man built like a structural element of something large, whose reputation for physical dominance was so thoroughly established that it had become a kind of shorthand. His name invoked in tactical discussions the way you invoke a natural force, something to be accounted for rather than argued with. He had never, in the record of his adult life, been in a room for a negotiation where he was not the most powerful presence in it. He arrived at the meeting location, a neutral building in a border settlement, with 6 guards and an expression of contained impatience, the look of a man performing a necessary but distasteful concession to circumstance. He had been told he was meeting a supply coordinator, someone who could restore the Eastern food lines. He had agreed to the meeting the way powerful people agree to things they consider beneath them, tolerantly, from a position of presumed authority, prepared to dictate terms. Sable was already in the room when he arrived. She was seated at a table with documents she did not look up from immediately, which was either rudeness or confidence, and he was already recalibrating the situation before she raised her eyes because the documents were real, and they contained information that should not have been available to a supply coordinator. And the quality of attention she gave him when she finally looked up was not the attention of someone who had been waiting for him. She knew what he needed. She knew it with specificity, the exact quantities, the exact timelines, the exact routes that could carry the supplies without interception. She also knew, and this she allowed to become visible slowly, in the way that someone allows the implications of a hand of cards to reveal themselves across the course of a conversation rather than all at once, the things about his campaign that he had not told her. The reserve, positions that were less secure than his reports to the council suggested, the alliance with the northern border lords that was 3 weeks from fracturing over a payment dispute, the specific vulnerability in his eastern flank that his own intelligence officers had flagged and that he had chosen to manage quietly rather than report upward, because reporting it would require explaining decisions he had made 6 months ago that looked worse in retrospect than they had at the time. She did not weaponize any of it, not directly. She simply allowed the conversation to proceed in a way that made it clear she knew, and that she was choosing to proceed as a partner rather than as someone holding consequences over him, and this choice, this specific decision to show the card without playing it, was more effective than any threat she could have made. Threats create enemies. Demonstrated restraint creates something more complicated, a mixture of relief and wariness and the specific discomfort of obligation that people feel toward those who have chosen not to harm them when they could have. Garrett Holt left that meeting having agreed to terms he had not intended to agree to, having shared information he had not intended to share, and carrying with him the unsettling understanding that the room had not been arranged in the way he had assumed when he entered it. He was the first. He was not the last. Lord Devon Ashcroft arrived 2 weeks later, representing the coalition of Central territories. He was different from Holt in every surface way, younger, leaner, possessed of a political intelligence that Holt's blunter approach lacked, trained from childhood in the specific arts of negotiation that the central families prized above military prowess. He came to the meeting with the explicit intention of acquiring what he needed while giving away as little as possible, operating on the assumption that he was the most sophisticated person in the room and that his task was simply to identify the leverage points that would let him dictate the exchange. He spent the first 20 minutes of the meeting being systematically and very gently disabused of this assumption. Not through confrontation, through the accumulation of small moments in which it became clear that the information he had brought to the negotiation as leverage was information she already had, that the alternatives he had positioned as his fallback options were options she was already aware of and had specific reasons for knowing he could not effectively use, and that the picture of her operation he had constructed from available intelligence prior to the meeting was accurate in its broad outlines and missing the details that changed the meaning of every broad outline he had gotten right. She knew about the secret treaty he had brokered between two ostensibly hostile pack lords 3 months before the war started. She knew about it, not because she had intelligence operatives embedded in those negotiations, though she did, but because both lords had been clients of hers for years, and both had, in the way that clients often do with the people they trust most to keep their secrets, told her things they had not told anyone else. She knew about it, and she said nothing about it. And the fact that she said nothing about it while clearly knowing it told Devon Ashcroft everything he needed to understand about the nature of the conversation he was actually in. He agreed to her terms. Like Holt before him, he left the meeting carrying information he had not arrived with, specifically the understanding that his position in the war was more dependent on factors outside his control than he had been operating as though it was. He found this disturbing. He found her more disturbing. He found the combination of the two most disturbing of all, because he was intelligent enough to trace the implications forward and see where they led, and where they led was somewhere that the existing power structure of the Northern Reach had no framework for accommodating. The third meeting was different. Alpha Commander Rennick Vale did not come to negotiate. He came with 12 guards and the specific energy of someone who has decided that a situation requires resolution rather than discussion, to make clear that the arrangement Sable had been operating was not going to continue in its current form. He was 41 years old, the head of the largest single military force currently active in the Northern Reach, and he operated from the foundational belief that any concentration of power that existed outside the recognized hierarchy of the packs was an aberration that the hierarchy had both the right and the obligation to correct. He was not wrong about the belief in the abstract. He was catastrophically wrong about its application to this specific situation, but he did not know that yet, and the discovery was going to be expensive. He laid out his position with admirable directness. The network she operated would be absorbed into the official supply structure of the Vale Coalition. She would be compensated for the transition at a rate he named with the confidence of someone who believes the number matters because they are the ones stating it. Her existing contracts would be honored by the coalition, and all parties to those contracts would be notified of the change in operational control. She would be given a position, an actual title in an actual administrative structure, with protections and obligations appropriate to that position. It was, by the standards of the world he operated in, generous. It was the kind of offer extended to someone you have decided to absorb rather than destroy, which in the culture of the Pax was considered a meaningful distinction. He expected either acceptance or negotiation of the specific terms. He was prepared for either. He was not prepared for her to decline. She declined without hostility, with the specific quality of regret that is indistinguishable from finality. She thanked him for the offer, which she appeared to mean, and she told him it wasn't possible, which she absolutely meant, and she told him why in terms so clear and so structurally precise that even he, whose relationship to structural thinking was more intuitive than analytical, could follow the logic and see where it went. The network's value was not its physical infrastructure. It was not the warehouses or the routes or the supply contracts or any of the material elements that could be mapped and catalogued and transferred. Its value was the relationships that ran through it. Relationships built on years of demonstrated discretion, of needs met without judgment, of secrets kept that other parties would very much like to access. Those relationships were personal. They were calibrated to her specifically, to her specific quality of reliability, to the specific understanding that the parties had developed over years of working with her, that she would not weaponize what she knew unless the alternative was her own destruction. Transfer those relationships to an institutional structure with different incentives and different accountabilities, and they would dissolve, not because the parties would refuse formally, because trust is not a transferable asset. It lives in the specific history between specific people, and it dies when the person it belongs to is removed and replaced with an institution that has never earned it. Rennick Vale understood this intellectually. He rejected it emotionally, because accepting it required accepting a conclusion he was not built to accept, that there was a form of power that his strength could not reach, that the kind of leverage he had always relied on was simply inapplicable to this specific situation, that he had arrived in this room believing he was there to dictate terms and had instead been given a lesson in the limits of the only language he had ever needed to speak. He left without accepting her terms. He did not make a threat. He was smart enough to understand that making a threat he could not effectively execute was worse than making none, and the process of working out whether he could effectively execute a threat against her was already generating in the back of his mind a calculation whose early results were not encouraging. Because the hidden truth of the situation was already becoming visible to him, the way hidden truths always become visible when you finally ask the right question. The question was not how to take her network. The question was what happened to his operation if he made an enemy of the person who supplied it. He went home and asked his logistics officers how long his forces could sustain their current operational tempo if the existing supply chains were disrupted. The answer came back in hours. It was not the answer he had wanted. It was the answer she had known he would receive when she chose not to accept his offer. The answer she had calculated before the meeting. The answer that made her refusal not a risk, but a move, because she had already known what he would learn when he asked the question. She was, as she had always been, 10 steps ahead. Not because she was faster, because she had been paying attention to the right things for years while the people who believed they held power were paying attention to each other. The attempt on her life came 6 weeks after the Vale meeting. It was professional, which she had expected, and it failed, which she had also expected, because the security architecture around her actual location had been built on the assumption that attempts would come from people who believed they knew where she was and what she looked like and how she moved, and all of those beliefs had been carefully cultivated to be incorrect. The woman attacked on the road outside the settlement was not Sable. She was a contact, a trusted one, who had agreed to the risk in exchange for a debt cleared and a future favor of significant value. And she survived the attack because Sable had known it was coming and had prepared accordingly. The attackers were identified within 48 hours, not by official investigators, but by Sable's network, which had 3 separate sources close enough to the Vale operation to observe the planning meeting where the decision had been made. She did not retaliate immediately. She filed the information in the same place she filed everything, in the deep architecture of a ledger that existed entirely in her memory, and she continued operating. And she allowed Rennick Vale to believe for 3 weeks that his attempt had failed through bad luck rather than design. Then she made a single adjustment to his supply chain. Not dramatic, not the kind of thing that generated an immediate crisis, a delay, a rerouting that added 12 days to the arrival of a specific category of medical supplies that his winter campaign was going to need by a particular date. 12 days was the margin between adequate and insufficient. She knew this because she had his operational documents obtained through a source so embedded in his administrative structure that he would spend months after the war trying to identify it and never would. The delay cost him a forward position, not the war, but the position. And the message it sent was precise and unmistakable, not because she announced it, she never announced anything, but because he was smart. Enough to look at the sequence of events and understand what he was seeing. The attempt, the silence. Then 12 days later, a supply chain failure calibrated to cost him exactly as much as she had decided it should cost him. No more, no less. She had not destroyed him. She had demonstrated that she could. The difference between those two things was everything. The Pack Lords began to understand, one by one, and then collectively, with the specific quality of collective understanding that arrives when enough individual calculations have reached the same conclusion, that what they were dealing with was not a supply coordinator, not a black market operator, not even a power broker in the conventional sense, someone who could be bought or intimidated or absorbed into existing structures through sufficient application of force or resources. What they were dealing with was someone who had built her power from the one resource that none of their existing strategies could account for. The complete and total dependency of every faction on a network that only she could maintain. She knew what everyone needed. She knew what everyone feared. She knew who was betraying whom, which alliances were real and which were performances, which leaders were as strong as they appeared, and which were holding positions that were one bad season away from collapse. She knew these things because she had been paying attention for years, and because the people who possessed this information had been giving it to her in exchange for the services she provided, not knowing or not caring that each transaction was adding to a picture whose full dimensions would have terrified them if they'd ever been able to see it. The secret that made all of them frightened was not the supply network. The supply network was visible, or at least visible enough that they could conceptualize it and therefore think about how to address it. The secret was the information she had accumulated alongside the supplies, the years of conversations overheard through the people who moved her goods, the documents seen through the administrators who processed her invoices, the strategies revealed through the officers who requisitioned her medical supplies and, in the vulnerable state that physical need creates, said things they would not have said in more guarded circumstances. She knew about the illegitimate son that Lord Garrett Holt had placed in a border garrison under a false name, hoping to protect him from the political consequences of his existence. She knew about the treaty that Devon Ashcroft had negotiated in secret, the one that contradicted 3 of his public positions and would, if it became known, destroy the alliance his entire military strategy depended on. She knew about the financial arrangement that 2 supposedly hostile Pack Lords had maintained throughout the war, each funding the other's operations through intermediaries 3 layers removed from anything official, each bleeding their territories to sustain a conflict that was, on a financial level, generating profits for both of them through mechanisms invisible to everyone outside the arrangement. She knew about the council member who had been selling route information to the opposing faction for 14 months. She knew about the Alpha commander, whose celebrated victory at the Morn River crossing had been enabled not by tactical genius, but by intelligence purchased from one of her contacts. Intelligence that had never appeared in any official account of the battle, and whose origin the commander had spent considerable energy obscuring. She had not used any of it, not once, not for leverage, not for profit, not for the kind of power that the Packs understood and respected, and could therefore account for in their calculations. She had kept it the way she kept everything, as information, as understanding, as the accumulated weight of a picture that only she could see in its entirety. This restraint was the most frightening thing about her, to those who were beginning to understand what she was. Power used is power that has defined itself, that has shown its edges and its limits and its preferred directions. Power held in reserve is power of a different category entirely, because its limits have not been tested. And in the absence of tested limits, imagination fills the space with possibilities that are almost always more extreme than the reality. The Pack Lords did not know what she would do with what she knew because she had never given them a data point from which to extrapolate. And the uncertainty was a kind of control more complete than any threat she could have articulated. She was 24 years old. She had been building this since she was 11. And the war that everyone else was trying to win was the event she had been waiting for, not because she had wanted the war. She had spent years maintaining the supply relationships that made war slightly less catastrophic for the people caught in it, but because war clarifies. It removes the ambient noise of peacetime politics and leaves only the essential questions, And the most essential question of this war, the one that nobody had thought to ask before the official routes collapsed and the shortages began, and the pack lords found themselves in rooms with a woman none of them had ever considered important, was the question of what power actually was. Not the performance of it, not the symbols of it, not the hierarchies and titles and bloodlines that the structure of the packs had been using to define it for as long as anyone could remember. The actual thing, the actual capacity to determine outcomes, to decide what happened next, to sit in a room full of people who had spent their entire lives accumulating the markers of dominance and be the only one in the room who already knew what everyone else was going to need before they knew they needed it. For the first time in the history of the Northern Reach, the predators were negotiating with the person they had always looked through, and the person they had always looked through was not desperate, not grateful, not performing the appropriate deference that her position in the structure theoretically required. She was patient and precise, and in possession of more leverage than any of them had yet fully calculated, and she was making decisions about how to use it that none of them could predict, because none of them had ever thought to study her the way she had spent years studying them. Drop a comment that says, "She was always the most powerful one in the room," if this story is already sitting with you the way I think it is, because what she does next with all of that leverage, the decision she faces when she finally has every faction exactly where she needs them, is the kind of choice that makes everything before it feel like preparation. The war is still burning, the pack lords are still fighting, and Sable is sitting with the knowledge of exactly how to end it, and exactly what ending it would cost. And the weight of that knowledge is the heaviest thing she has ever carried. Because power without accountability is easy. Power that can see the full consequence of its choices is something else entirely. And she can see all of it, every thread, every life at the end of every decision, with the same clarity that had let her see the structure of that first market square at 11 years old, except now the market square is a continent at war, and the goods being traded are not dried herbs and root information. They are lives, thousands of them, waiting on a choice that only she can make, and if you made it here, you already understand something that most people in that kingdom never did. Power doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't wear a crown. It doesn't need an army behind it. Sometimes it looks like someone quiet in the background who simply understood the game better than everyone else. If this story hit different for you, if you saw yourself somewhere in her silence, her strategy, her patience, drop a comment right now. Write, "I'm still here, and I'll know exactly who stayed until the end. I'll be here building more worlds like this one." If you want to be around when the next one drops, subscribing is the simplest way to make sure you don't miss it. There's a video right next to this one that picks up where we left off. Different story, same kind of energy. Click over and keep going. I'll meet you there.